Welcome to today's podcast, where we're going to be looking at the importance of people over programs. You know, if you're in a smaller attendance church running, say 200 or less, which is the majority of churches in the United States and a lot of places around the world, one of the problems is oftentimes we feel pressure to have certain programs. And you probably have heard the comments quite frequently from individuals that have chosen not to continue to come or not to join with your fellowship. Things like, well, you just don't have the programs that we want for our children or our youth, or there's not as many other programs. And there tends to be this focus and pressure on the smaller attendance church to try to have a lot of programs. And that really is not a justified pressure if you understand the dynamics in a smaller attendance church. So today we want to talk about the importance of that smaller attendance church and discipleship that can happen in a way in a smaller attendance church that it just doesn't happen as well in larger attendance churches. So our focus is going to be on cultivating an organic discipleship process, approaches that help us to be able to grow organically in a relational discipleship type of a way. Joining me today, I'm glad to have joining me today is one of the pastors that's joined us in the past, and that is Dwayne Rogers. Dwayne, we're glad to having you join us. Dwayne is a bivocational pastor of a church just outside of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in Greenwell Springs. I believe I said that right, didn't I, Dwayne?
Yes, Bobby, that's it. Greenwell Springs.
Greenwell Springs. And so, Dwayne, we're glad to have you back. Glad to have you joining us again here back on the podcast. This is a really important topic, and we're going to try to, I've divided our discussion up into basically 5 kind of categories. We're not going to try to unpack them all extensively, but let me just kind of give that highlight real fast. We're going to talk about the program paradox that we have in a smaller attendance church, rediscovering the relational roots of discipleship, cultivating organic growth, breaking down the barriers, and then we're going to talk in closing about the future of faith in small churches or smaller attendance churches as we go. So let's kind of jump into this if we can as we get started. So Dwayne, why don't I throw it to you first off? Let's talk about briefly, why do traditional programs often fall short in small church settings?
Bobby, there again, thanks for having me today, by the way. I appreciate me inviting me back to join your discussions, one of your discussions. But there are a number of reasons that smaller churches the programs don't normally or may not work in a smaller churches, and I found that a couple of things are really key, and one is time. In especially more rural areas or suburban areas, people tend to spend a lot more time traveling to and from work, and often they're not able to commit exactly. For instance, as a bivocational pastor, I drive 45 minutes each way to my vocational other job that I have, and that's Monday through Friday, 8 hours a day. And so scheduling those programs on a regular basis, knowing that you've got to plan for contingencies, is often much harder in a rural setting or smaller setting. And then, of course, there's the issue of the resources as well. To a larger church with a budget that's not as slim, maybe, or has maybe a little more cushion on it than what many smaller churches do. When you're looking at, let's just say, buying books or workbooks or any kind of resources, that's often more of a challenge than it might be in a church that's not smaller.
Well, and another thing I think of oftentimes, people don't think about it, but it's staff. In a smaller attendance church, oftentimes it's a single staff, a bivocational church that may have someone volunteering to lead the music or worship, or even somebody who's paid part-time to do that, and the pastor. So even if he's bivocational, which means he's not able to be, on the scene 24/7 as such, he's available, obviously, in crisis and that kind of thing. But there's just not enough staff to do a lot of the quote unquote program type things that you find in larger churches, as they are able to staff and do that. I think realistically, there is a frustration or burnout with program overload when you're in a smaller attendance church. One of the things I thought about when I was preparing this was the first church I became pastor of. We were in seminary, and I was working through seminary, and the church was about 2 hours and 15 minutes from the church. And I drove back and forth at least twice, sometimes as many as 4 or 5 times a week, with, things that were happening in that community, as I was pastor there. And one of the things we had a real problem with was on Wednesday nights. And we had about 5 kids that came on Wednesday nights, but they ranged from first grade to 6th grade. And so we weren't able to have age group like missions programs or something of that sort. And we really wanted to have some mission education going on Wednesday nights. And so I called at that time the Brotherhood Commission and WMU both. And the guy at the Brotherhood Commission at the time, I had a long conversation with him, explained my situation, told him I was spending usually 8.5, 10 or more hours in the vehicle commuting back and forth. Plus, I was a seminary student full time. Plus, I was pastor of this church. And ultimately, after a long conversation, his response was, I really wish we had something that was for boys and girls, and it was multi-age like you're describing. He said, that would be great. He said, let me make a suggestion to you. He said, why don't you sit down and write up that kind of curriculum and try it out for maybe a quarter, and then get back in touch with me and send me what you've got. And maybe there's a way we can develop something like that. And I like to blew my top. I mean, I didn't say anything then, but my head's running 90 miles to nothing. You're kidding me. I'm working, 70, 80 hours a week and all this commute time, et cetera, et cetera. And this is your job full time, to be helping churches with missions education. And you're telling me that I should write a curriculum to use with these 4 or 5 kids that were coming, and then give it to you and let you look at it and see if it could be replicated. I just like to blow my lid. So,
sure.
The other thing that I see is a real frustration in, the whole idea of programs is the whole idea, excuse me, the whole idea of there are so many quote unquote big box programs that come out. And you can go to conferences, you go to other places, you go through our denomination, Southern Baptist, at Lifeway or other places, and you see these programs, and then you get them, whatever it is, for missions, discipleship, whatever it is. And oftentimes it talks about things that are just not feasible in a smaller attendance church. They'll say, break your group up into groups of 7 and take, 4 or 5 groups of 7 and assign them the following da 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 da. And it's like, are you kidding? In our church, we don't have but 6 that are there total. We can't break the group up into groups of 7 or whatever. And so I found myself, my entire ministry, mostly bivocational, in smaller attendance churches, having to retool what I was getting in boxes of things that we thought would be useful, but I could use them as they came. I had to look at it and go, okay, I get the gist. I get what the intent is. Now, how can I make that work to help our people be better disciples using this, this kind of material? It's just a continued frustration, at that point, without a doubt, I think. Well, look, let's transition again. let's talk about the relational roots that we have in this kind of discipleship, that it's not a big box or a program driven discipleship. It's more of a model that's relating to people. So do you think there's a historical biblical model of discipleship that's better than some of these programs give to us?
Oh, I think so. When we think about that, and yes, I have that same frustration, Bobby. We see the new programs that are coming out and launching, and we read about from NAM or IMB or our state conventions, and we know churches that are able to. I mean, they have the staff and the resources at time to have even multiple types of programs going on, not just your traditional age divided groups, but other things, special evangelism or as we're saying, talking here today, discipleship programs are going on. And for the smaller church, sometimes it's very frustrating because we want to be on top of everything. We want to have the ability to employ the latest and greatest techniques. But when it comes down to it, sometimes we just need to take a step backwards. I think it's very historical. And again, there's certainly many biblical models to a relational type discipleship. Just a couple. I'm thinking, and in evangelism, just thinking of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. I'm thinking of Paul when he was saved, and how Ananias was brought in there for the discipleship, and so. And Jesus with his followers himself. Often, when you break that down or step back rather than a totally programmed model, but just something building personal relationships with people, I found that at least in my settings, that's been the most effective way for people to be involved in evangelism as well as discipling someone. And the same way with me, if I'm discipling, wanting to disciple an individual, a particular person, or whatever, it's about building that personal relationship with them. It just works a whole lot better with me than following a rigid program saying I've got to meet with this person, every week, and here's the outline of things that I've got to cover. No, I want them to experience um, real life ministry settings, and often the best way to do that is just have them spend time with me.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt, especially for pastors. Sometimes we get, uh, let's just call it entrenched. We get entrenched in the some of the mechanics of things we have to do. Not that that's bad. You have to have that, the organizational structure and that kind of thing to get your job accomplished, to adequately prepare to be able to preach, however many times you're doing that a week, to teach the Bible, et cetera, et cetera. But the life on life relational, the informal, as you're mentioning, is a huge piece. I remember one of my churches where actually several churches, I had this same approach as a pastor. I always made sure I took one of my deacons or a layman with me when I went to make a visit. Sometimes that was an evangelistic visit. Sometimes it was follow-up visits to people that had been to the church, whatever it was. But I wanted to go with them, or them go with me as we went to visit those people. And there were not only valuable conversations along the way, but I remember one situation. We had a couple that were, say, mid-50s, I believe, that had been visiting the church several times. And so we were going to make a visit to the house. And my understanding was that the husband had made a profession of faith. The wife had definitely not, and she said so. So as we're there making the visit, the Lord just opened the door in conversation. So I had my New Testament with me, and I walked through kind of some scriptures about salvation. Long story short, she prayed to receive Christ. He broke down. The husband broke down. He was crying, and he said, I need to recommit myself. If she's going to follow Jesus, I've got to be the leader in my home, et cetera, et cetera. Ended up being able to baptize him or baptize her. he wanted to be baptized just as an act of obedience. So we baptized him as an act of obedience. Didn't count that, quote unquote, in the baptismal numbers, but that wasn't the reason. The reason was he wanted to show he was being obedient to following Christ again, and great outward expression. But when we were driving back to the church after leaving their home that night, the fellow I was visiting with, I heard sniffling, and we're driving on backcountry roads and it's dark. And so I'm not looking around, but I heard him and I said, hey, are you okay? And through a crackly voice, he said, I've never been present when somebody prayed to receive Christ.
Wow.
Now, this is a guy who'd been a deacon in this church 25 years. And I like to run off into a ditch.
Yes, sir.
I was like, you got to be kidding. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. He said, I've seen lots of people that were saved like at some kind of a big group meeting, or like in a revival service, or in a church service. He said, but I've never been sitting there. He said, that's incredible.
Wow.
Long story short, after a period of time, we implemented kind of an evangelism training for people, and it was all built on relationships. And this guy ended up being one of my kind of mentorees, and went through the whole process, learning how to do this, helping to learn some of those things to make you more comfortable transitioning into gospel conversations. And it was, I mean, it was all because I was taking that informal approach to have him just go with me. And I think that's a kind of encouragement most pastors need to hear. How do you think smaller communities naturally foster these kind of relational dynamics?
Well, there's again, there's a number of different ways that folks can do that. We often hear at well, not just the church that I'm at now, but churches I've been at past. We've done things like game nights and make sure that our folks invite, and by that I mean different table games and card games that we can sit around at and do, and invite somebody that has not been before, or not even attended the church before, and sit down. And you might be amazed at some of the discipline type questions and discussions that sometimes open up in these informal settings. Certainly, there's nothing better to get a group of people together than some good food, and as well. So having whether it's a potluck, or whether it's we just had a gathering where, of course, I'm in South Louisiana, so a lot of folks are some good cooks around here. We just had jambalaya after church. A couple of weeks ago, and we had a larger than average number of attendees that day, because I guess everybody knew that they were going to get fed. Those kinds of things are good things to get people who are not necessarily regularly involved, but also to use for evangelism, or at least get other people introduced to the gospel. You mentioned something just a moment ago, and it certainly takes work, because I'm guilty of that as a pastor. I love to do that as well, but I find often I said, well, I don't have the time to take out to make sure that we can schedule this when it's convenient with somebody else, and so I'll just go make it. But what you're talking about doing is so important, because there's nothing that I believe affects a person or makes them a greater witness than them having experienced and being in the presence of somebody praying to receive Jesus Christ, and being transformed by the power of the gospel and the presence of the Holy Spirit. That really impacts folks and fires them up.
Yeah, well, walking side by side with people, I think, is what we're talking about. Is just, as some would say, doing life, and that can relate to being a disciple in the sense of evangelism. That could be just simple growth. It could be developing spiritual disciplines. There are all kinds of things. I remember some years back, I would take on a couple of people. I wasn't a pastor at this time, but I was working with a lot of young people and college age, that kind of thing. And we would just have a weekly, we call them survival suppers. So we would meet for pizza most of the time, and sitting across the table in the pizza place. In fact, they started reserving a place for us because they knew we were coming, and we would have discipleship conversations. How do we grow? How do we develop spiritual disciplines, et cetera, et cetera? And it wasn't a big formalized kind of a program. It was a matter of just sitting down, having conversations. And what that bled over into where there were many conversations that happened during the course of a week when you would cross paths or something would come up. There was a comfort level among people because you'd intentionally brought them along with you at that point on those survival suppers, for instance, where they felt comfortable asking you some hard questions that had come to mind or had come up in another discussion somewhere, at that point. So I think that's a real reality. Well, let's talk
Absolutely.
about a little bit more about how we develop this kind of an organic kind of growth within our church. There are 3 practical steps for identifying and equipping natural leaders within a small church congregation. And I'm going to use this acrostic LAP, L-A-P, L for listen, A for assign, and P for pair. So it's really simple. Just listen to people. When you're in Bible studies, when you're in small group settings, listen to people, listen to how they talk, listen to who takes the lead, listen to who has the probing questions, find ways to listen to identify people who have potential. Once you identify someone, then assign them, find a way to assign them to a more mature believer. And this doesn't have to be, quote unquote, a big program at all. It can be more informal and simply talk to person B who you're wanting to see discipled and assign them to person A to take along with them when they go make a visit, take them to the hospital when they go to the hospital, whatever. Find a way to assign them to something that would be helpful. Even pairing them up with somebody who can co-teach a lesson, help them to teach the lesson. And that's where the pairing comes. You're assigning them something to do to help them to grow. And then you're pairing them with someone that's a little bit more mature to help them to be able to grow and be mentored by someone that's a little bit more experienced. It's just a simple way of remembering that LAP, L-A-P, listen, assign, and pair. Dwayne, as we're thinking about this more, what do you think are some strategies for facilitating informal mentorship and small interest-based gatherings?
Well, you hit there on something you were saying there, and that is going back to the lap and listening to people. You need to find out what their interests are. I remember years ago when I was at New Orleans Seminary. In order to graduate from there, you had to finish the witnessing program called CWT,
Oh,
and
yeah.
and part of that was you had to. One of the things was when you were going and meeting somebody and going to share the gospel, figure out what their interests are and use that to build a rapport with them. If you see bass, a couple of different mounted bass hanging on the wall, then you can kind of guess somebody enjoys fishing. So use that to help gain get into build a relationship with that person. And so I think that's important in our strategies. We need to understand people's interest. If they don't have an interest in an area, they're not going to be, at least at first, not going to be as willing, be a willing participant in something. But if you can connect and find out what their interests are, and then make that connection in what type of ministry or areas of discipleship that you're wanting to teach them in, I find that you'll connect better and certainly be more successful because they want to understand. They have a yearning. So if you can connect those two, that's great. Often, a lot of times, we'll find out even something as simple as whether it's going and doing a service project, a ministry project for somebody in the community that has a need. If they need steps rebuilt, if you have somebody that has an interest in carpentry, then you can make that connection and then use that time to disciple them while you're working on on that project, and have them teach you some things, or whoever they're paired with, about what they're doing. But try to compare that with ministry as a lay person should carry out.
Yeah, Dwayne, while we're unpacking that, let's jump into a little bit more of what are some of the barriers. What do you think are some common barriers about moving beyond established programs when you're in a smaller attendance church like we've been for most of our ministry?
Well, I think from a pastor's perspective, I certainly can speak to, and that is worrying about the time to prepare for some of these programs that that you have to get ready for, and have to have a lot of resources and do with, and also is just having the time to be committed, and because you're being accountable to someone. And so if you don't want to commit to something up front, and then know in 3 weeks something's gonna come up where you're not going to be able to fulfill it. So I think we have a fear of failure, and so I think that's part of it. So if we can establish some programs that are not as programmatic, so to use the word, and have some flexibility in them, we can still be accountable. We can still accomplish discipleship, but not have a fear that we're going to fail. And that's also one of the reasons that a lot of people don't like to use or develop their own programs, is because, well, this over here must be proven. So if I do something on my own, I found that you can often plan something out that is not as rigid as what some of the other prepackaged plans are, and you might be surprised how successful you can be.
Yeah, you used the illustration a while ago of using CWT. I did CWT and stuff over the years as well. And I wasn't in a church where we could do CWT right out of the
Right.
package. It was not doable exactly like it was. Now the presentation was very similar. Well, I mean, we basically used that presentation, but the way they had it set up to be done was basically a larger church kind of a thing where you had tons and tons of people, and we barely had 200 that were coming at the time, and that's a little larger than a lot of smaller attendance churches, but it's not huge for sure. And we ended up having dozens and dozens and dozens of people who were ultimately trained in a very slow process, meticulous process of learning how to share the gospel, just using that tool. And that's all it is a tool. But the way we had to do the training had to be different than the way it was prepackaged as such. So I think there's a lot of fears, especially if you're not gifted at retooling, that becomes an issue. That can be a fear.
Sure.
I thankfully am one who tends to look at things and go, okay, now how can I make that work? I just have that kind of a knack to make it more understandable, make it more doable at that point. But what I'm saying is, if you as a pastor or a key leader in a church, that's not your strength, then find somebody who can take the key concepts from something that maybe is a program and help it to become relational, help it to be something that can be done one-on-one, regardless of what the area of growth really needs to be, in your church. Historically, many Southern Baptist churches exploded back in the 50s, 60s, using Sunday school and the 5 steps that were put out there to be able to grow your Sunday school and all those kind of things. And incidentally, those things still work today. It's just a little different now in today's world with visitation and that kind of thing. But the reality is churches in the 80s and 90s, particularly early 2000s, started saying, well, we're going to get away from Sunday school and we're going to go to a small group model and this, that, and the other. And oftentimes what they did was they kept the key components of what made Sunday school successful, put it with a new name on it, a new label, and tried to approach that. Smaller attendance churches tend to grasp a hold and hold on to what they're familiar with and not want to change at any drastic pace. And so sometimes it's not worth the effort of trying to make a change. Sometimes this is a good leadership principle for small church pastors. Sometimes you don't need to change what's there, just develop around it. Just like I mentioned, the Sunday school and doing CWT and some of those kind of things, we found out that trying to work around instead of replacing some of the training that could have been done in a programmatic kind of way ended up working. And what ends up happening, if you're doing that, if what you're doing is successful, then more and more people get involved, more and more people come in on it, more and more people get involved in it. And after a period of time, whatever it may be, it may just fade off in the distance. And that's exactly what happened historically now over what we knew growing up as BYU or, Baptist young people, discipleship training. There were several names over the years, and churches have replaced that over the years with other things that are still attempting to disciple. They're just not trying to use, quote unquote, the discipleship package in the sense of discipleship training. So I think you're right. There are common fears of moving beyond what we see as some kind of established programs oftentimes. Well, let's wrap up this section talking about how do you think it's best to transition toward a more organic discipleship model without causing disruption in your church? What are some tips you could give us?
Well, we're just talking about it, going back to my CWT days. Part of that I still remember today that I teach people to use in building personal relationships to disciple or evangelize, and that is the acrostic fire. And that's where I got that interest out of a while ago. But it starts at learning something about their family. People love to talk about their family, so that F stands for family. Talk about those. When you go into somebody's home, ask about. There's nothing more than I like to do, brag about my grandchildren, and so ask about them. Do they have any? Some things like that, and you can take components. And it took me a number of years, Bobby, to figure out that I didn't have to do that whole program. I could take components of that, and so I use teaching them that fire acrostic, asking about their family, asking about their interests, asking about their religious background, and then coming down and asking them the exploratory questions. But I teach that, and then I say, okay, and then you can go right in to share your testimony. And we worked real hard, just went through about a year ago, training our folks, and amazed how to share your testimony in 3 or 4 minutes. And we got it down to that. And people got excited about that, and that was taking something from much larger programs and just taking parts out of it that people didn't feel overwhelmed about. And they say, I can use that when I go next door and drink coffee with my neighbor, or if I'm out having lunch with someone, or whatever the case might be. And so I think that's a transition, not necessarily telling them this is what we're going to do necessarily in the end, but teaching these small components, these different tools, and then opening their eyes to say, you can pull these tools out of your tool bag at any type setting. And so I think that's a gradual way, rather than saying, hey, this is what we're going to do. No, start teaching, giving them those little tools, and then let them fill that bag up, and then they can use what they're comfortable with.
Yeah, I often tried to illustrate it. I'm not a golfer. You may be, but I'm not a golfer, but a lot of people are. But when you're a golfer, what you understand is you've got a bag full of irons and woods and all kinds of different things that will stroke very differently once you're on the golf course, right? And so you've got to know all the clubs you have and exactly what the club is used for. Those are your tools of that game when you go out to play. So when you're 25 foot away from the hole, you don't pull out a wood and try to clunk it. You're just 20 foot. You need a putter, right? And so all of those are tools that are in your bag. So when you're a believer, you need lots of different tools. Every setting is not going to be the best setting for a given tool. You need to know what to do. Springing off of what you were talking about, especially with evangelism, there's several times over the years in my ministry, people have talked about, well, I just don't know the Bible verses to use in sharing my faith or whatever. And so I would say, hey, why don't we learn how to walk through a Mark New Testament to be able to share your faith? And several times we've actually bought little small Mark New Testaments that are kind of pocket size, and we've passed them out to everybody in the congregation. And on a Sunday morning, my sermon was basically preaching how to walk through the Mark New Testament. And I had everybody take the Bible. Okay, here's the verse. Let's mark that verse, John 3:16, whatever it was. As we walk through it, I used illustrations. I used stories. I talked through basically exactly how I might share my faith when I was using that Mark New Testament. Then by the time we got to the end, I would say now I would want to transition into saying, is there any reason why you wouldn't want to make a commitment to Christ or something similar? And every time I did that in a public setting, with anywhere from a dozen or a couple of dozen of people all the way up to several hundred people in one church, and I would do that, I would extend an invitation just like I would anytime preaching. And we had people saved, people that came forward that said, I've never heard it explained that way. And they were saved. We followed up on them, ended up being baptized and began discipling them, etc. I did have one deacon got really upset with me and said, why would you throw away the preaching time to walk through something like that? That's like a discipleship training class or something. You shouldn't do that. And I said, so you're telling me that those 3 people who came and got saved because we did that, helping everybody to understand how to do it, that might not have happened, probably wouldn't have happened had I preached on something else on that given time. And he just was kind of dumbfounded, like, okay, yeah, I didn't really think this through that well, and I never heard another peep out of them about it. And so there're just different ways you can do that. That I heard after doing that several times from people who said I was able to take my Bible and walk through this with people who I'd been talking to in discussions and other kinds of things. So there are lots of ways to do that. Let's talk about, as we wrap up, what do you think the future of faith is in smaller attendance churches? What do you think is the future of faith?
Well, I think it's well, and I think that in the smaller churches, the future for it is good too. Looks good. The thing that we have to get over is, I think, especially from outside looking in or from inside looking in, is that all churches don't look alike and shouldn't look alike and don't have to look alike. And you mentioned all the programs earlier. We don't have to strive to have all of this in a smaller church. If so, we're just going to feel defeated all the time, because it's just not possible. I think that the organic or basic personal relationships that we've been talking about is often better incubated in a smaller type setting in small churches than they are in largers. And that's why, even larger churches, most have small groups, because they realize that that's where discipleship takes place. That's where real faith is communicated, I believe, back and forth between participants.
Yeah, well, and the reality is the desire for some type of significant relationships is innate in many people. And we live in a world that is very non-community oriented in the sense of the people around you, those relationships oftentimes. So a smaller attendance church has a much better chance of being able to develop that. Here's one phrase I wrote down that I think is helpful. Need to envision a thriving small church that is deeply embedded in its community, discipling through everyday life. So if there is some type of event going on in the community, how can we harness relationships to do that? How can we engage people? Everything doesn't need to be a hard, let's just call it a hard sell evangelistic kind of a push. If you have a kind of a small town fair that is in your community or in your county or something, church could set up a thing and have some giveaways and just have a place for interacting with people and building relationships, connecting with people, getting those contacts where you can continue to do that. And the development of those kind of relationships is much stronger oftentimes in a smaller attendance church. How many times can you imagine sneaking into a larger attendance church, a church running 300, 400, 1,000, multi-thousand, and be able to sneak in and walk out without really having any significant conversation? In the smaller attendance churches that I've been in, one of the things we've sought to do is help train our people not to smother somebody who is new, but to be able to engage them, get to know them, introduce them to other people. Hey, have you met Bob? Hey, have you met Sue? They're teachers, in the school system too. And connect people in some way that oftentimes you can't do in a larger situation, for sure. I mean, that's just kind of the way it is sometimes, and it just makes a huge, huge difference. Let's talk about, in wrapping up, the long-term benefits of organic discipleship. I jotted down a couple of things: increased retention, deeper faith, and authentic community impact. Jump off of that and build on that for us, Dwayne.
Mm. I think it's so good. Again, when you have personal relationships with someone, they're not going to tend to get lost, like you're saying, in a larger church. If somebody can tell if somebody's having in a crisis, or will know about they're in a crisis, or if you have a personal relationship with them, you're going to know if they're something's out and they're missing and something's going on in their life. I think all of that helps those personal relationships to be accountable with one another, but also minister to one another in times of need. And that's when often when our faith grows deeper, is in those crisis situations. We're planning something coming up, though we have a acreage in our physical location at our place of fellowship, right next to the entrance of a subdivision where there's, I don't know, 150 families in there, and there's a small park in there. Well, we're planning on having just a meet your neighbor day, and we're not going to be blasting. This is Indian Mound Baptist Church putting this on, or whatever the case. It's just going to be a community meet your neighbor day, and we're going to supply, snacks and food and some music and different things, but just let the community come together and meet one another. But yet we're going to be using that as, again, so that we can meet our neighbors and build those personal relationships, and then after that have a chance for evangelism or discipleship. In other words, we're not going to be utilizing that. That is not a primarily evangelistic outing that we're going to have. Now, I'm not saying that's not going to happen over in the corner somewhere where somebody's talking one-on-one something. I hope. It's great to see God moving those ways. But our intention is just to get to know people, meet people, and begin building relationships with them.
Yeah, Dwayne, thanks again for highlighting that. Dwayne's been a bivocational pastor, smaller attendance churches for a number of years. Let's let this be the kind of final question that maybe you can impart some wisdom for us, Dwayne. How would you encourage small church leaders to embrace this effective discipleship path forward, not programmatically, but relationally?
Well, Understand this. You've got Jesus met people personally where they were at, and that's what we've got to do. It's not a mass communication effort, although that works for some people in certain ways. But we've got to build personal relationships and understand that that size does not necessarily equate with success. Um, I think that oftentimes, if we will come to understand that, smaller can mean more effectual impacts on people's lives if we'll just accept that and work towards it.
Yeah, I think so. And when you find people, go back to that lap acrostic we used a minute ago. Listen, assign, and pair. Listen. Those who seem to have potential, and then assign them to others who can be mentoring them by pairing them up together. And that would be in whatever it may be. It might be teaching, it might be a discipleship small group of some sort, it might be a Sunday school class, it could be in evangelism, whatever it may be. It doesn't have to be some kind of quote unquote out of the box program per se, as we look at something like that. I think that's good encouragement to small leaders to be able to embrace this kind of relational, effective, organic kind of discipleship model, rather than feeling like it all has to fit between A and Z within a box, for sure. Dwayne, thanks again for joining us today and shedding some light upon this, helping us to be able to see exactly what this model looks like to organically be able to do that. It's good to have you join us again as we come back and look at other ministry issues in the near future.